Across the shattered silence of Europe, the bells were ringing, rifles firing into the air, banners flying high to mark a day of liberation. For millions, it was the end of 6 long years of fire and ruin. Yet as I stood in the shadows of a ruined railway yard, clutching my suitcase with trembling hands, I knew this day meant something very different for me. The crowds outside were celebrating freedom, but for us, the women in faded gray-green skirts, our boots cracked, our hair tangled from weeks of retreat, this was the beginning of captivity. I felt the weight of the irony press down on my chest. The world was cheering, but we were herded into trains that once carried soldiers to the front, now carrying us toward an unknown fate. The air stank of smoke and ash, the ruins of cities passing by like ghosts outside the window. I heard whispers among us. Fragments of fear pass from one to another. The Americans will not spare us. They will make examples. Those words lodged deep in me, filling the hollow spaces where hope should have been. I was only 20, my fingers ink-stained from years of typing orders in a Munich office. Now I stood in line with other secretaries, nurses, radio operators, cogs in a broken machine. My suitcase felt unbearably light, as if it carried nothing but dread. Somewhere inside I carried a diary, small and fragile, though I feared I might never find the courage to write in it again. The cheers of freedom echoed far away. But here in the silence of the train yard, all I could feel was a question sinking deep into my bones. What would happen to us, the defeated, once we crossed into the hands of the enemy? The train yard smelled of rust and smoke, a place where silence pressed heavier than sound. We shuffled forward in thin lines, our boots scraping the broken stones beneath us. The bells that had rung for victory hours earlier no longer reached us here. Instead, the air was filled with the hiss of steam, the clank of couplings, and the muffled sobs of women trying not to be heard. I clutched the handle of my suitcase until my knuckles turned white. It was not even a proper suitcase anymore, only a patched box of leather with its corners frayed, holding little more than a blanket, a comb, and a diary. For years I had thought I knew fear sirens, bombings, the long nights in basements while the walls shook around us. But this was a different kind of fear. A fear of what waited beyond the horizon, carried westward by the iron wheels beneath our feet. The guards shouted for us to climb into the wooden cars. They looked at us not with cruelty, but with the flat expression of men doing their duty. That indifference frightened me more than rage. Inside the car, the air was close and thick with the smell of unwashed bodies. Women huddled together for warmth, clutching their belongings like shields. One girl from Hamburg clutched a rosary, her lips moving silently as the train lurched forward. Another muttered under her breath, repeating what she had heard from an officer. "The Americans will make examples of us." The words spread quickly like embers caught in straw, until the entire car seemed filled with a tremor of dread. I tried to steady my breathing, but each rattle of the tracks carried me deeper into the unknown. Outside, the landscape slipped by in fragments. Ruined churches, their spires snapped like broken fingers. Bridges that dipped into black water collapsed under the weight of bombs. Children stood barefoot on the embankments, their faces gray and hollow, watching us pass with eyes too old for their years. I wanted to wave to remind them we were human too, but my hands would not move. Nights were the worst. The train would halt in the dark, the sudden silence broken only by the echo of boots on gravel as guards paced outside. Sometimes gunfire cracked in the distance, a reminder that even in defeat, the land was not at peace. We curled against one another, our breath clouding the cold air, whispering small comforts that sounded like lies. Some women wept quietly into their sleeves. Others stared into the dark, as if bracing themselves for a blow they could not avoid. I pressed my forehead to my knees and thought of home, my mother boiling weeds into soup, my brother's laughter now lost to the Eastern Front. I wondered if she thought me dead. Perhaps she would prefer it rather than imagining me in enemy hands. Days blurred into one another, the rhythm of wheels on tracks beating like a drum inside my head. Hunger gnawed at us, but worse was the thirst. Tin cups rattled empty tongues, cracked against dry lips. When water was given, it was never enough, and we passed cups from hand to hand, each woman sipping, as though it might be her last. The whispers never stopped. Some swore we would be forced into shameful labor. Others claimed we would be paraded through American streets as trophies. I did not know which fate was worse. In rare moments, I found myself staring at the guards through the cracks in the car. They were young, most hardly older than we were, their rifles slung loosely, as though even war weariness had claimed them. They did not sneer, nor did they smile. Their silence was more unbearable than cruelty would have been. It left me with nothing to fight against, only my own spiraling thoughts. The car swayed endlessly. Sometimes I closed my eyes and imagined the train was carrying me home back to Munich before the bombs, before the orders I typed, became death sentences for people I would never meet. But the illusion never lasted. Reality returned with the stench of sweat, the scrape of boots, the sob of someone in the corner. When at last the train halted for longer than a night's pause, we were herded out into air, salted by the sea. I stumbled down from the car, my legs unsteady, and stared at the harbor stretching wide before us. Ships loomed under foreign flags, their hulls massive and waiting. My heart sank. This was no German camp. We had reached no place where familiar voices might be overheard. We were being carried farther still across an ocean, into the very heart of the land we had been taught to fear. Some women clung to each other, their eyes darting toward the soldiers who lined the docks. I expected jeers, blows, humiliation. Instead, the men watched us with an unreadable mix of curiosity and detachment. The absence of cruelty unsettled me. If they had shouted, I could have braced myself. But their silence felt like a veil hiding something I could not yet see. We were counted divided-handed slips of paper, as though we were pieces in a puzzle being sorted. It was not vengeance, but bureaucracy. That difference rattled me more than rage would have. The ship's gangway loomed a wooden spine rising into the belly of steel. One by one, we climbed the weight of our suitcases, dragging us down our hearts, dragging us deeper still. I glanced once at the shrinking shoreline, the ruins dissolving into mist, and wondered if I would ever set foot on that soil again. Inside the ship, the air was thick with diesel and salt. Bunks were stacked like coffins, the metal walls sweating with condensation. Some women collapsed immediately, overcome by seasickness. Others clung to their belongings, as if they could shield themselves from the waves rolling beneath us. I pressed my diary against my chest, though I had not yet written a single word since the day of our capture. Words felt dangerous, as though if I admitted my fear to paper, it would become too real to endure. Food was issued on trays, pale bread, and steaming mugs of something bitter but warm. My hands shook as I accepted mine. For years we had lived on ersatz bread, little more than sawdust and barley, and soups so thin they tasted only of metal. Now I stared at the slice in my hands, white and soft, and I could not eat. Part of me thought it must be poison, some cruel trick. Another part wept silently at the thought that even in captivity the enemy gave more than our leaders ever had. The days at sea stretched longer than the tracks behind us. Each sunrise brought a horizon of nothing but water, endless and gray. The ship's engines throbbed beneath our feet, a reminder that we were being carried farther from everything we had known. At night, as the Atlantic roared against the hull, I lay awake, listening to the sobs and whispers around me. I thought again of my mother, of her hands rough from scrubbing floors, of her voice telling me to be brave. Did she know where I was? Did she imagine me? Already lost. I wanted to write, to carve some piece of myself into memory, but the words stuck like stones in my throat. I had been raised to believe that hatred could shield me, that the enemy was a beast whose cruelty would confirm our righteousness. But hatred was useless here. Hatred could not explain the bread in my hands or the indifference in the guard's eyes. Hatred could not prepare me for the land waiting across the sea. And so I sat in the belly of the ship diary, closed suitcase at my feet, heart thudding like the engine's pulse, and I whispered the question that none of us dared speak aloud. What would happen to us when we reached America? Would we be broken, humiliated, erased? Or would the enemy reveal a face we could not yet imagine? When the ship finally groaned to a halt, and we were marched down the gangway onto American soil, my heart hammered with a dread so thick it felt like a second skin. The sea voyage had been a blur of nausea, sleepless nights, and the gnawing belief that something terrible waited at the end. Now the streets, clean and untouched by bombs, opened before us. Crowds gathered, some jeering, others merely curious. Their stares clung to us as we stumbled off the ship, clutching suitcases that seemed too small to hold even the fragments of our lives. We were counted again, tagged like cattle shuffled onto buses that rolled us inland. My eyes pressed to the window, taking in the impossible green of fields, the neat rows of houses, children riding bicycles, as if the war had never touched them. The abundance made my throat tighten. It was all too intact, too alive. Germany was rubble, America was whole. That contrast alone was unbearable. The buses pulled up to a camp surrounded by barbed wire guard towers at measured intervals, rows of wooden barracks painted and orderly. My chest constricted as we were herded through the gates, but the atmosphere was not the gray brutality of what we had imagined. No snarling dogs, no guards shouting insults. Instead, everything moved with quiet efficiency. We were lined up, names, recorded possessions, cataloged. Then the guards, firm but not cruel, directed us toward a building with tiled walls and a sharp smell of disinfectant that drifted out into the cold air. Whispers broke out among us. I heard the word showers hissed from mouth to mouth, tinged with horror. We had all heard the rumors. Showers could mean humiliation. Showers could mean worse. My legs trembled as we stepped into the line, the door ahead yawning like a threat. Inside, the air was warm and thick with steam. Pipes clanged overhead, their rattling echoing down the tiled corridor. My skin prickled with sweat, though I was shivering. Women clutched their suitcases tighter, some crossing themselves, others muttering prayers under their breath. One girl whispered to me, "This is where they will shame us. This is where they break us." Her words sank into my chest like lead. I could not look at her, afraid that if I met her eyes, I would believe it fully. The line crept forward, each step heavier than the last. My stomach twisted, nausea rising as though the sea itself had followed us inland. The guards stood nearby, impassive, watching, with expressions that betrayed nothing. I searched their faces for cruelty, for satisfaction, but saw only the distant indifference of men performing a routine. Somehow, that unsettled me more. When my turn came, I braced myself for blows, for jeers, for some unspeakable violation. Instead, a hand thrust something heavy into mine. I looked down, startled. It was a bar of soap. Real soap, thick, white, smooth, and faintly fragrant, smelling of something almost floral. My fingers trembled around it as though it might dissolve. For years we had scrubbed ourselves with slivers no larger than coins or ersatz soap that left our skin raw. This bar felt luxurious, absurd in its solidity. Before I could understand, a towel was pressed into my arms, coarse but clean, smelling faintly of starch. Then came the order to undress. My body stiffened, shame burning my skin. But no laughter followed, no mocking words. Only the hiss of water as the pipes overhead came alive. Hot water poured down in heavy streams, striking my back, my shoulders, my face. I gasped, staggered beneath its weight. For years we had washed in cold basins, our skin blue and numb, scrubbing with icy water that never reached beneath the grime. Now the heat wrapped around me, seeping into my bones, loosening the crust of dirt and fear that clung to me. My breath caught in my throat, and before I could stop it, tears spilled down my cheeks, mingling with the streams that ran down my face. Around me, the sound of weeping rose and echoed against the tiles. Some women sobbed openly, their voices breaking like glass. Others laughed in short, hysterical bursts, unable to believe what was happening. One girl, her hair plastered to her head, whispered over and over, "It's only water," as though saying it would keep her from drowning in disbelief. I lifted the bar of soap, rubbing it against my arms. The lather foamed thick and white, sliding away in rivulets that carried months of soot and sweat with it. I stared at the bubbles, astonished by their simple beauty. My hair, matted and tangled, loosened under the stream. I felt lice wash away filth I had stopped noticing, dissolving into the drain. For the first time in years, I felt clean. Truly clean. It was almost unbearable. I caught sight of myself in a fogged mirror by the wall. The face that stared back was pale, gaunt eyes rimmed with red, but beneath the exhaustion I saw skin again, Not the mask of dirt and grease that had become my identity, but the face of a young woman I barely recognized. For a moment I hated the reflection, because it reminded me of what had been stolen: youth dignity, ordinary humanity. To have it returned by the enemy was a cruelty I could not comprehend. When at last we stepped out of the showers, our bodies still steaming towels wrapped around us, we were handed clean garments, plain, practical clothes, but whole. The fabric was soft against my skin, almost kind. I pulled the shirt over my head, and for a heartbeat, I felt like I might collapse under the weight of the contradiction. That night, lying in my bunk, my hair damp against the pillow, I opened my diary with trembling hands. I wrote in uneven script, the ink smudging as my fingers shook. We were told we would be mocked, beaten, stripped of dignity. Instead, we were given soap. How can this be? My chest ached as I pressed the words onto the page. Hatred had been simple. It had built a wall around me, shielded me from doubt. But now kindness, unexpected, absurd kindness, was the blow I could not deflect. The barracks hummed with whispers. Women spoke in low, urgent voices, confessing what they could not yet believe. They treated us like human beings. Why? Why would they? It must be a trick. The air was thick with confusion. Some clung to suspicion, insisting poison lingered in the soap, that tomorrow the cruelty would begin. Others lay in silence, tears glistening on their cheeks. I turned my face into the pillow, listening to the crickets outside, the foreign night alive with sounds of life instead of artillery. The warmth of the shower still lingered on my skin. The scent of soap, faint but undeniable. It haunted me more than hunger ever had. I thought of my mother, of how she would not believe me if I told her this. I thought of the ruins of Munich, the cellar where she boiled weeds, and how she might weep to know her daughter had been restored to cleanliness by those she had been taught to call monsters. Sleep did not come easily. My body was at peace, but my mind churned. I replayed the sensation of the water on my shoulders, the bubbles dissolving into the drain, the strange laughter of women rediscovering what it felt like to be human. The Reich had promised us pride and glory, but gave us hunger and filth. The enemy had given us soap. What did that mean? What did it demand of me? Days later, the memory of that first shower remained sharper than any image of the journey. I could still feel the bar of soap slipping in my palm, could still see the faces of women transformed, their fear cracking into relief. It was a memory that clung tighter than shame, because it was not humiliation but restoration, and that was harder to endure. In the end, it was not hunger that broke me, nor fear, nor even defeat. It was soap. The simplest, gentlest thing pressed into my hand by an enemy I had been taught to hate. That moment lodged inside me like a stone, shifting everything I thought I knew. And as I lay awake at night, my body clean, my heart heavy, I realized the battle was no longer against soldiers or nations. It was inside me now, in the space where hatred once lived, and where something far more dangerous, fragile, undeniable, was beginning to grow. The memory of that first shower clung to me like a second skin, unsettling in its gentleness. But the shock of soap and hot water was only the beginning. In the days that followed, another revelation struck us with even greater force: the food. The morning after our arrival, we were herded into a long wooden building that smelled of coffee and frying grease. My stomach knotted as soon as the scent reached me. For years we had lived on crusts of ersatz bread, watery turnip soup, and the rare scrap of horse meat. To smell coffee so strong it fogged, the air was unbearable. I braced myself for disappointment, for some cruel trick that would leave us hungrier than before. Inside the mess hall stretched wide rows of tables, lined with trays. At the far counter, cooks in white aprons ladled stew into tin plates, dropped slices of soft bread onto trays, poured steaming mugs of coffee. The abundance hit me like a physical blow. Potatoes boiled until they gleamed carrots bright against thick gravy, chunks of beef that glistened with fat. Butter melted over rolls so soft they looked unreal. My feet felt heavy as I moved forward, as if walking toward something forbidden. When my turn came, a cook placed a spoonful of stew on my plate, without a word, then slid bread and poured coffee until the tray was full. My hands shook as I carried it to the table. I sat down on the hard bench, staring at the food, unable to lift a fork. Around me, the other women were frozen, their trays glowing like miracles they dared not touch. One whispered, "It cannot be real." Another muttered, "There is poison." Suspicion coiled among us, bred by years of fear. I dipped my spoon into the stew. Grease floated on top, thick and heavy. Meat shone beneath the broth. My hand trembled as I lifted it to my lips. The taste was overwhelming. Salt, fat, warmth, all things forgotten. My throat tightened, and before I knew it, tears spilled down my cheeks. I pressed my hand to my mouth, ashamed, but I could not stop eating. Around me, sobs broke out, laughter too brittle and wild. Women bent over their trays, devouring food with shaking hands, some still weeping, others silent in awe. The guards walked the aisles with rifles slung carelessly, not shouting, not taunting, simply watching. Their indifference gnawed at me. I had braced myself for cruelty, for insults hurled as we ate. Instead, we were left to our own shock, to wrestle with the fact that the enemy had given us more in one meal than our own leaders had in months. One woman whispered, "My brothers starved in the snow, and here they feed us like this." Her words sank into me deeper than the stew. The meals continued day after day, until the strangeness dulled into a routine I could not accept but could not refuse. Each morning a bell rang. We lined up, received breakfast, then were sent to work. But even the work carried contradictions. Some women were assigned to fields harvesting crops under the Sunday. Others worked in laundries, scrubbing and pressing American uniforms. I found myself folding shirts with initials stitched into the collar's clothing that belonged to men who were once only shadows on propaganda posters. Now they were fabric in my hands, clean and warm from the iron. It was work, but not the back-breaking labor I had feared. At the end of the week, we were handed slips of camp script currency of paper stamped and numbered. At first, I did not understand. Then someone whispered that it could be used at the canteen. That evening, we crowded into the small wooden shop shelves, lined with items that seemed like artifacts from another world. Chocolate bars in bright wrappers, cigarettes stacked in neat rows, pencils, notebooks, jars of jam, and lipstick, red glossy, impossible. I stood frozen, staring at the shelves, as though at an altar. My hands shook as I picked up a bar of chocolate, smooth and heavy in its wrapper. I had not seen chocolate since I was a child. I paid with my slips of script, unwrapping it with trembling fingers. The first bite melted on my tongue, sweet and rich, flooding me with memories of a life before war. Tears pricked my eyes, and I turned away from the others, ashamed of my own joy. A girl from Bremen bought lipstick holding the tube like a relic. She smeared it across her lips in front of a small mirror, her face transformed in an instant. She laughed softly, her voice catching, and said, "I feel human again." Her words burned inside me. To feel human, was that not the very thing we had lost? And here, in the hands of the enemy, it was being returned to us in bars of chocolate, in tubes of lipstick. At night, back in the barracks, I lay awake with my stomach full, my skin clean, my hands smelling faintly of soap. Letters from home came rarely, each one carrying despair. Families wrote of hunger, of bombed-out apartments, of children barefoot in the snow. One woman read her mother's words aloud. "We live in the cellar now. We boil weeds for soup. If you have anything, send it." Her voice broke as she folded the paper. We all sat in silence, trays of food untouched beside us, guilt pressing heavier than hunger ever had. The irony was sharp, unbearable. Germany had demanded our loyalty, sent us to man radios, to type orders, to labor in the shadows of war. In return, it had given us only hunger, filth, and ruin. America, the enemy we had been taught to hate, gave us soap, bread, chocolate, even lipstick. The thought coiled inside me, bitter and relentless. It gnawed at my soul, turning every bite of food into a question I could not answer. Some women resisted still. They hoarded bread under pillows, convinced that tomorrow the cruelty would begin. They whispered that the food was drugged, that the abundance was a trap. But as days turned into weeks, suspicion weakened beneath the relentless normality. No jeers, no blows, no poison, only routine, only abundance. Only the strange civility of a nation we had been told was monstrous. I tried to write in my diary, but words faltered. I managed only one line before closing the book in shame. The Reich gave us hunger. The enemy gives us bread. The sentence stared back at me like a wound unhealed and raw. I could not erase it. I could not deny it. Each morning the bell rang. Each day I worked. Each evening I tasted food that felt like betrayal. The pattern of life in the camp carved itself into me simple, yet unbearable. For it was not cruelty that broke me, but kindness. And in that kindness lay the deepest wound of all, the realization that the enemy, in feeding me and clothing me, in paying me for my labor, had given me more dignity than my own homeland ever had. The shock of the meals of chocolate in my mouth and coffee warming my throat lingered long after the first days in camp. But soon another weight began to press upon us, heavier than any fence or guard tower, the letters from home. They arrived irregularly, passed through censors, their pages worn and trembling with grief. The first time I held one in my hands, my stomach tightened with a fear greater than when the rifles had been aimed our way. I unfolded the papers slowly, as if bracing for a wound. My mother's handwriting staggered across the page. She wrote of nights spent in the cellar, the house above, shattered by bombs, rain dripping through broken beams. She wrote of boiling weeds for soup, of neighbors digging in rubble for crusts of bread. Your brother coughs at night, his ribs show through his skin. She scrawled her words, smudged where her hand had pressed too hard. We have heard nothing from your father in weeks. Perhaps he is gone. If you have anything at all, send it. My hands shook so violently that I nearly tore the paper. I looked around the barracks at women clutching their own letters, their eyes shining with unshed tears, their lips pressed tight to hold back sobs. The silence between us was heavier than gunfire. That night, trays of stew sat half-eaten on the tables. Bread lay untouched butter congealing in the chill air. The food had turned into ash in our mouths. One woman whispered, her voice trembling, "We are prisoners, and yet we eat better than our children." Another answered with nothing but a sob. The shame was unbearable, worse than hunger. I thought of my mother's thin hands and the weeds boiling in her pot while I sat with my stomach full and my cheeks regaining their color. Each letter sharpened the contradiction. Women read aloud stories of children barefoot in snow, of families crammed into cellars with no light, of old men bartering heirlooms for a loaf of bread. One woman from Cologne clutched her letter to her chest and cried out, "My son ate grass today, grass. And here I am with butter on my lips." Her words echoed through the barracks, each syllable a knife. We could not look at one another because in each other's faces we saw the same guilt. The irony cut deep. We had been told we were marching for the fatherland, sacrificing everything for its glory. But the fatherland had abandoned us to hunger, to ruins, to despair. And now in the enemy's hands we were fed, clothed, restored. Each bar of soap, each slice of bread, was an indictment. Our own nation had stripped us of dignity. The enemy impossibly had given it back. The shame grew until it filled every corner of the camp, pressing against us in the night as heavily as the air we breathed. Some women tried to resist the weight. They hoarded scraps of bread, hiding them under pillows, muttering that they would send them home somehow. Others refused to eat at all, pushing their trays away, as if rejecting food could erase the guilt. But most of us could not keep up the pretense. Hunger gnawed too deeply, and the body obeyed its own laws. We ate, and the taste of it was bitter, not from poison, but from conscience. At night, lying in bunks, whispers circled the room like smoke. How can it be one voice asked that we live in abundance while our families starve? No one answered, because the answer was too heavy to speak. The silence itself was the truth. I pulled my blanket tighter and stared at the rafters above my stomach, turning with fullness I did not want. The shame did not belong to one woman alone. It was collective, binding us in an invisible chain heavier than the barbed wire around the camp. We no longer measured our captivity in rations or hours of labor, but in the gulf between our lives and the ruins at home. Each day, of health, of food, of soap, became a betrayal not of the Americans, but of our own blood. The Reich had promised honor and given us only ruin. The enemy had given us survival. I tried to write in my diary, but the words faltered. Finally, I forced a sentence onto the page. We are prisoners, but we live better than our mothers, our children, our neighbors. This is the heaviest chain of all. My hand trembled as I closed the book. I did not want to see the words again, but they lived inside me regardless, sharp and unrelenting. When the letters came again, I did not rush to open them. I held mine in my lap, staring at the envelope, afraid of what waited inside. Around me, women wept as they read, some collapsing onto bunks, others clutching papers to their hearts like talismans of grief. When I finally broke the seal, my breath caught at the first line. We do not know how we will survive the winter. I pressed the page to my lips, as though the taste of the ink could bridge the distance between us. But the guilt only deepened. The camp itself seemed almost cruel in its order, its strange generosity. The paths were swept, the barracks warm, the shelves of the canteen still filled with goods. We walked past chocolate bars and jars of jam, knowing our families would give anything for such things. The contrast tore at us until laughter sounded hollow and smiles felt like sins. Even the guards seemed to sense it, watching us with unreadable eyes, as though they knew the weight we carried was heavier than their rifles. In the evenings, when the crickets hummed outside and the lights glowed soft against the fences, I lay awake, torn between gratitude and grief. My body was strong again, my skin clear, my hair free of lice. Yet each breath I took in health felt stolen from someone else. Hatred would have been easier. Hatred built walls. But this strange mercy left me exposed, forced to see the abyss between what we had been told and what was real. The others felt it too. In their silence, in the way they stared at their hands, in the tears that came without warning. We were no longer certain of who we were or where our loyalties lay. We were Germans, but Germany had left us in ashes. We were prisoners, yet the enemy gave us life. Between these truths stretched a chasm too wide to cross. And every letter from home, every whispered story of hunger, deepened that chasm until it seemed it might swallow us whole. That was the cruelest irony of all. Not that the enemy beat us, mocked us, starved us, but that they treated us with dignity, while our own homeland left our families in ruin. It was not whips or chains that bound us, but shame. And in that shame we carried a question none of us could yet answer, whether survival in the hands of the enemy was a gift or the greatest betrayal of all. The letters from home left me restless guilt pressing heavier than the fences around us. At night, when the barracks fell silent, except for the hum of crickets, I opened my diary again. The words came halting, jagged, but I forced them onto the page. My hand trembled as I wrote it. Hatred had been my armor, the fortress I carried from Munich to this camp. But each bar of soap, each meal, each neutral glance from a guard chipped at those walls until they crumbled. Daily life slipped into a strange rhythm. I folded American uniforms in the laundry, the scent of starch clinging to my fingers. I watched soldiers pass, with rifles slung casually, their faces unremarkable, sometimes even kind. One hummed a tune once, and another dropped a flashlight, thanking me quietly when I picked it up. These moments unsettled me more than cruelty would have. The Reich had painted them as wolves, but before me stood young men not so different from my own brothers. That recognition was the sharpest wound of all. Outside, the wire glimpses of America deepened the conflict. Towns untouched by bombs, shops with shelves overflowing, children running barefoot, not from hunger, but from play. I could not look without my throat tightening. Germany had promised victory and gave us ruins. America, the enemy, offered abundance. I began to fear not captivity, but release. The thought of returning to Munich, to cellars where my mother boiled weeds, filled me with dread deeper than barbed wire ever could. I closed my diary one evening and whispered to myself, I fear going back more than I feared arriving. The truth chilled me. The enemy's greatest weapon had not been rifles or bombs, but soap, bread, and dignity. And in giving me these, they had forced me to see what my own nation had stolen. The betrayal I felt was no longer aimed at those who guarded me, but at the homeland that had promised glory and delivered only ashes. And in that realization, the war inside me began, one far more difficult than the war that had ended. As the seasons turned and rumors of repatriation spread through the barracks, I felt a weight heavier than chains settle in my chest. Captivity had stripped me of certainty, but it had also given me bread, warmth, and the unbearable gift of dignity. To return meant facing hunger and ruins. To stay meant living with the enemy who had shown me a humanity my own homeland had denied. I understood then that the true betrayal was not here behind the wire, but back in the rubble of Germany, and that realization would haunt me far longer than war itself.